welcome to everyone. I'm really glad that you're all here with us today. My name's Elizabeth McMuntatenko, and I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Meredith Van Natta, who is going to be giving our Library Faculty Author Series talk today. The Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members. And if you'd like to be featured in a future Faculty Author Series talk, please let me know. For today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Van Natta here with us. Dr. Van Natta is an assistant professor of sociology and a medical sociologist here at UC Merced. Her research centers on the intersection of citizenship and science and medicine and technology policy. Dr. Van Natta holds a PhD in sociology from UCSF, an MA in Latin American Studies from UC Berkeley, and BAs in both Latin American Studies and History from the University of Kansas. Her book, Medical Legal Violence, Healthcare and Immigration Enforcement Against Latinx Non-Citizens, came out in March of this year, and we're so happy to have her here with us today. So I'm going to turn this over now to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. And I do apologize. There's a little bit of background noise because there are dogs barking outside, but hopefully it's not too distracting. And yes, so hi, I'm Meredith Van Natta. I'm going to be talking about this book, Medical Legal Violence. And I just want to, before I get started, give a really quick shout out to the UC Merced Library team for hosting the Faculty Author Series and for letting me be a part of it today. I am really, grateful for our UC Merced Library in so many ways. We have, like the instructional services and coming to our classes to help, really develop research skills among the students. So I just think it's a great resource, and I'm so glad to be increasingly involved with the library. Okay. So before I get started talking about the book itself, I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how I came to do this research in the first place. So before I came back to do graduate school and do my PhD, I was actually working as a surgical case manager in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this was in the middle of sort of the beginning years of the Affordable Care Act, which was a piece of legislation that expanded healthcare to a variety of people who had previously been ineligible. I also was basically responsible for connecting patients who were low income and uninsured, who were unable to get insurance through usual mechanisms like through work or through their employer or through what we call Medi-Cal in California, Medicaid. And so what I would do is we would have a queue of patients, a list of patients who are waiting for some kind of relatively simple procedure, something that could be done within a day. So this would be something like a hernia repair, cataract surgery. And my job was to match the patient who needed a service with a surgeon who would volunteer their time and a hospital that would write off the costs as what was called charity care. And so in these cases, a lot of time it was really straightforward, but sometimes we would do a diagnostic procedure for something like a breast biopsy or a thyroid biopsy or a colonoscopy. And the result would come back positive for cancer, right? And those cases were really challenging for me because that went beyond the scope of our charity care program. That was too complex, too complicated. And so the patients who lived in counties that had a robust safety net system, that had universal healthcare coverage programs, regardless of someone's legal status, it was a devastating diagnosis, but relatively manageable in terms of health systems, because I would say you've got your imaging, you've got your biopsy, you've got your, labs, and you can take them to the county hospital and then, take the road from there. But for the patients who came from more rural areas or areas that didn't have a robust safety net system, I was really unclear about what steps they would take next. I had to say, I'm sorry, we're closing your case. It's too complex for our program. Go back to your community clinic and hopefully you can figure something out. And I got frustrated or disappointed in these cases because I really didn't know what would happen for those patients who didn't live in a county with robust safety net healthcare. And so that's where I really started my research journey. So I came back to school to understand, and hopefully you can see this in my version of it. It's a little bit covered by the video, but basically I wanted to ask, what happens when I close someone's case? What happens when someone is excluded from the safety net on the basis of their legal status? And what if they live in a place without universal health coverage, right? What if there isn't a mechanism for them to get the follow-up care that they need? So I really wanted to trace that. And at the time, I thought, we've got the Affordable Care Act. It has a lot of exclusions for people based on legal status, but maybe we're heading into a time where we're expanding healthcare coverage, right? We're expanding the safety net. And there were also things like deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, and there was also a similar program that would have been proposed for parents of childhood arrivals. It was called DAPA. It didn't end up passing. But at the time, this was around 2014 when I decided to come back to do a PhD. I thought, well, maybe we're on the edge of some more inclusive policies, and I wanted to see what would happen. Of course, that isn't the direction that national politics took. And so I started this project and the data collection in 2015, but that was right before, the Obama administration ended, that had pioneered the Affordable Care Act and some of these provisional immigration reform measures, and into the Trump administration. So there was a big policy shift, right? The priorities around both healthcare reform and immigration reform shifted, not necessarily fundamentally, but at least in terms of the rhetoric, right? There was a rhetoric about dismantling the Affordable Care Act and, kind of pulling back on some of the expansions that had been made. And then, of course, there were goals expressed to undo DACA, to, get rid of it and to have a much more aggressive immigration enforcement regime, at least again, in terms of how it was described by the various administrations. So in this book, I talk about this. I talk about these changing politics and the underlying context for them as medical legal violence. And so to give you sort of a quick version of this about what I'm going to talk about today in the talk, in this book, I describe how anti-immigrant politics in the United States increasingly undermine healthcare for Latinx non-citizens in ways that deepen health inequalities while upholding economic exploitation and white supremacy. I argue that the surveillance and criminalization of Latinx immigrants that have been expanding for decades increasingly target not only individuals and their families and their communities, but also the institutions that promote their health and their well-being. So there are multiple processes happening here, and I want to situate it within an arc of anti-immigrant policies and a sort of retrenchment of the welfare state in the United States in recent decades. And so again, I witnessed during the course of my research an escalation in anti-immigrant politics. Now, this was very much in the rhetoric and the stated priorities of the administration, right? That sort of, from the shift from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. But I do want to emphasize that this is a trajectory that started decades ago, right? So when I talk about anti-immigrant politics, I'm also talking about these twin phenomena of immigrant criminalization that has increasingly taken place since about the late 1980s. So looking at from the Bush administration through the Clinton administration, especially during the Clinton administration, and then, through the contemporary era. So we have a lot of policies that pass, especially in the mid-1990s, that criminalize both migration as a movement and immigrants themselves. And we have changes in our social welfare policy, something called welfare reform, that also happens in the mid-1990s. Right, so both of these things really take root and accelerate in the mid-1990s, which is actually under the Clinton administration. And what they create is a space of increased injury, illness, and the possibility of removal or deportation for a lot of non-citizens in the United States, especially for folks who are coming from Latin America. And so I situate the empirical story that I saw unfold within the framework of racial capitalism, right? So there's white supremacy, right, that is kind of embedded in institutions and in systems and structures in the United States. And also we're in a neoliberal capitalist system, right? And so thinking of that as the background, what I've noticed is, and I'm not the first to notice, but in sort of the background of the case I'm describing today, is this overlapping of economic inclusion, where you have a pool of almost captive labor of workers who are coming from, especially from Latin American countries, to to participate in the economic system, right? Working, purchasing, being consumers and producers, being embedded in systems of credit and finance in the United States, but being socially excluded from a lot of public benefits programs through especially these laws that passed in the 1990s, and through the inability to naturalize oftentimes and participate in the political process. And this collision of these two different social processes creates a situation of increased injury and harm, and also disposability. So we talk about, especially after the pandemic, this idea of the essential worker, right? But essential often gets conflated with disposable. And I think that's really what comes through in a lot of the work that I've done. So again, medical legal violence is the mechanism that I'm describing, and I'll give you empirical examples of this, as the talk proceeds. But it's essentially this combination of white supremacy, anti-immigrant laws, and exploitative labor conditions that uphold racial capitalism in the United States, and they do it through this mechanism of medical legal violence. And an example of this, a contemporary example of medical legal violence that became really salient in the work that I was doing, is this thing called public charge. Now, public charge has existed since the 1880s, but it's gone through various iterations over time. And basically what it is, it's criteria for inadmissibility. So basically, if someone's trying to get a visa to enter the United States, or if they're trying to adjust their status to naturalize, then they might be judged by these public charge criteria, which are basically public benefits that the US government deems as signaling that someone might become a burden on the US taxpayer, right? This public charge is a criteria of exclusion that has changed since the 1990s. It was kind of fixed in some federal guidance, but then the Trump administration proposed expanding the criteria for public charge. And this gets a little bit nuanced and complicated, but the takeaway is that there was a lot of chaos and confusion around what counted as public charge. And that is the environment of confusion, anxiety, and fear that a lot of the participants that I spoke with reflected on during the course of my research from 2015 to 2020. I also want to emphasize that when I talk about legal status, it's not just, is someone a citizen or are they not a citizen? It's not dichotomous in that way, but there's a whole continuum, right? There's people who are born in the United States and are US born citizens. Then there are naturalized citizens. There are also people who have a green card, who don't have citizenship yet, but are on the way. Then there are people who have a provisional or liminal status. That's something like temporary protected status, TPS, or DACA. And then there are folks who are, considered more undocumented in that they don't have necessarily formal documents that authorize presence in the United States, right? So there's a continuum here, and there are people that I've spoken with through my research all along this continuum, and they're all being impacted by medical legal violence, right? So it's not just a this or an and or, but it's actually this continuum that we're looking at. And also we have to situate this in the context of the United States, where immigration law is a federal purview. It's under the federal, it's the sort of like preemptive power of the United States government to legislate and regulate immigration, right? But it often devolves to the local context, where there are sometimes partnerships between local law enforcement and the federal government, the immigration enforcement regime, or there are policies like sanctuary jurisdictions that resist having to sort of be an immigration enforcement by proxy at the local level. And so this makes a big difference then when someone is negotiating the healthcare system, where they live, what kind of immigration and law enforcement policies are in place, and also, how the health context, again, is it a place that has really immigrant inclusive healthcare policies, or is it one that has really exclusionary policies, right? The state and county that someone lives in can make a big difference to their health chances. And so because of this, I actually did my research in 3 different states. I have what I call a blue, a red, and a purple state. And this reflects the kind of electoral politics at the time that I did the research. Blue being progressive, red being more conservative, and purple being kind of mixed, right? Where the governor is of one party and the legislature is of a different party, right? So it's a mixed governance system. But I don't use the names of the state because at the time I did the research, there was a lot of concern, especially among the legal experts that I consulted, that if I named the state and I named specific policies, if there were policies that benefited immigrants, then that would be precisely the kind of thing that an anti-immigrant administration would target and maybe penalize the clinics and the patients for those more inclusionary policies. So I exercised a lot of caution, and that's why I'm kind of using this pseudonym of blue, red, and purple. So the blue state, again, is more politically progressive. They offered full scope Medicaid for non-citizens in very special cases, right, on the basis of some kind of health condition. The red state site was more, it had a history of more anti-immigrant politics at the local level, and it did not offer full scope Medicaid for non-citizens under any circumstances other than, and this is true for all states in the United States, there's emergency Medicaid that is available under emergency conditions or pregnancy and childbirth for income eligible non-citizens. But this is an exception. For most places, at the time that I did the research, it was very difficult or impossible for someone who was a non-citizen and who didn't meet the criteria for Medicaid to get full scope Medicaid coverage. And then the purple state was more politically conservative than the blue state. It was a place where they did not expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. And if you have questions about this in the Q&A, I can answer more about the sort of federalism in the Affordable Care Act. But basically, they had a really limited social safety net and healthcare safety net because they refused federal money to expand Medicaid at the state level. And also, this is a place called the New South. The scholars call it, the New South because it's a relatively new immigrant destination, especially compared to my blue and red state sites. And then in terms of my methods, I did ethnographic observations in clinics, conferences, town halls that, immigration and healthcare issues were discussed. And I interviewed 80 individuals. These were patients at the clinic. They were staff at the clinic. Sometimes they were providers. Sometimes they were like administrative staff. I also interviewed some community partners that worked closely with clinics. And I did the interviews in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, depending on the preference of the participant. And these little N equals in the different circles, that's the number of participants that I had in each site. So 27, 32, and 21. And I can talk more about the specific policy contexts and the breakdown of the demographics of the participants. I have a slide for that, but I don't want to try to caught up in the weeds yet. Again, if you have questions, for sure, in the question and answer, feel free to ask them. And then theoretically, for those of you who aren't sociologists, I'll just really quickly go through. When I talk about medical legal violence, I'm actually engaging with theories that came well before me. So, we think about violence usually as an interpersonal phenomenon, right? Someone hurts someone else. But as sociologists, we also think about violence as structural, which means that it's embedded in systems. So it doesn't even require animosity between two individuals, but it can harm through systems. When we think about, for example, structural racism, that's an example of structural violence, right? It doesn't require an individual racist, but it gets embedded into systems so that even without individuals, it kind of has its own self-sustaining momentum and it can create harms. We also talk about symbolic violence in sociology. That comes from Pierre Bourdieu. And, it's to break it down in really simple terms, that's when there's domination that happens, not necessarily materially and through force, but through symbols, right, and expressions. And so an example of this in my research is when a participant describes themselves as illegal, right? People can't be illegal. That doesn't really make sense, but symbolically, there's a narrative that creates illegality among people. And so when people start to refer to themselves as illegal, that is an example of symbolic violence. And there are scholars in the immigration world, Cecilia Menjivar and Lesia Abrego, who have combined structural violence and symbolic violence in the term legal violence. And this is the increasing entanglement of the criminal legal system and the immigration law system, right? And so it increasingly targets not only non-citizens and immigrants generally, but also mixed status families, immigrant communities, right? And we see it typically in schools, the family, the workplace. And so I'm extending and sort of readapting this framework of legal violence for the clinical context. And I call this medical legal violence. And to give you something to hold on to, if you want to do a screenshot or something, basically what this is the expansion of legal exclusions of non-citizens through health institutions and clinical care. And it targets both immigrant patients and clinic workers. So irrespective of their legal status, clinic workers are getting caught up in the same system of legal violence through healthcare institutions. And so if you're a visual person, this is a bit of a conceptual model, right? So these are the different pieces that sort of form legal violence as a process and as a kind of social force. Part of it is criminalizing immigrants' everyday life, right? Part of it is interior immigration enforcement, not just at the border, but in other spaces. It's also about immigrant labor precarity, right? Those exploitative labor conditions that I talked about at the beginning, and the criminalization of healthcare workers. And so, to give you sort of examples to think this through in more concrete terms, you could think about criminalizing immigrants' everyday life in terms of on the road being pulled over without being able to be eligible for a license, right? If people are not able to get a license in some states, then they have more criminalization potential through everyday things like going to work, driving on the roads, in schools, right? Inability to get in-state tuition, things like that, at work, and for my case, in clinics. The interior enforcement piece is this idea that I heard from a law professor that was speaking during one of my ethnographic observations. And she said the border is everywhere, right? Even in a place that's very far from the actual physical border between countries. We hear this immigrant labor precarity. We think of that in terms of essential yet disposable labor. And then with criminalizing healthcare workers, this is actually altering clinical practices because of immigration law. So you wouldn't think on the top, just sort of like out of common sense, you don't think that doctors and clinic workers are having to conceptualize immigration law when they create a clinical care plan. But we're seeing that this immigration law starts to creep into healthcare spaces, and that is sort of the framework of medical legal violence that I'm proposing. To put it in a nice box, like literally, so that you don't have to hold all these theories and history in your mind, I'm explaining that this legal violence is medical because it directly implicates healthcare workers, and it impacts clinical care by creating treatment differentials based on both citizenship status and geography, right? The state, the county, the institution that you attend can have huge consequences for the healthcare that you're able to get. So I've been talking a lot about the theory and situating it in the literature, but I want to give you some concrete examples of the research that I did, right? And so I'll frame it with the patient's perspectives and also the clinic workers' perspectives. And I know it's a bit of a bleak story, so I'll conclude with some examples of resistance against medical legal violence that I saw when I was doing observations and interviews over these 5 years of research. So I'll start with the case of Maribel, who is a blue state patient. This is one of the first interactions that I observed in the field work that I was doing. This was in 2016. And it's actually kind of a inauspicious date that I happened to be at the clinic. And so this was in September 26th, 2016, actually, where I observed that Maribel came to the clinic and met the clinic worker that I was shadowing for the day, whose name was, her pseudonym was Elizabeth. And Maribel explained that she wanted to be disenrolled from clinic services. She had fled Central America, had experienced violence, was actually in the process of applying for asylum. She was really confused about the asylum process. She thought she was being processed for deportation. And she was really concerned that by coming to the clinic, that she was going to be registered on some kind of government database and that immigration enforcement would be able to locate her and process her for deportation. She was the mother of a US-born child, though she had an infant, and they were receiving care at a community clinic in a very progressive jurisdiction in this blue state site. But she asked Elizabeth, nonetheless, to disenroll her from clinic services, disenroll her family, because she perceived that the immigration enforcement officials would track her down and seek her through the clinic. Elizabeth was a little bit taken aback by this, right? This is a very welcoming clinic, and she's thinking, there's nothing bad that will happen. Again, this is 2016. And she said to Maribel, this clinic paperwork isn't going to put you at any risk. This is something more administrative. If you haven't committed any crime, they won't come looking for you because they're giving you an opportunity to fight your case, right? To fight for asylum. But Maribel did not seem persuaded at all. And she said, I came here fleeing. I'm afraid that this information would go directly to immigration and that they'll arrest me, right? So for her, from her perspective, in 2016, in September, even though this was a very progressive and welcoming jurisdiction, the threat of federal immigration enforcement really shaped her desire or reluctance to engage with the clinic. And as it happened, after I did my observations in the clinic this in the morning, that evening I went home and watched the first televised debate between then presidential candidates Trump and Clinton. So Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were giving their first debate, and this is the time when one of the more sort of notorious and infamous racist phrases was spouted, right, by then candidate Trump about immigrants from Latin America. And so the idea that Maribel that morning felt unsafe going to clinic spaces because there was all this sort of intensive anti-immigrant rhetoric and aggressive immigration enforcement rhetoric being proposed made a lot of sense, right? Her fear, her anxiety seems very logical within that context. And so, I continue to do field work over time. Of course, during the Trump administration, a lot of shifts were proposed in terms of immigration enforcement priorities. And in 2018, in the summer, I don't know if you'll remember, but there was a lot of outcry around family separations at the border. And I happened to interview patient Laura in June of 2018, and she was very concerned about this escalation in immigration enforcement that she saw on the news. And she had good reason to be concerned. So she was an undocumented resident in a red state site, again, a very a very aggressive immigration enforcement context. But she was also the caregiver for her gravely ill, also undocumented father. I actually met them when her father, Sebastian, was waiting for a urology appointment at a free clinic, and he looked very ill. I mean, he had, he was wearing still hospital items, had, like a walker, could barely walk, and had a drain that was sort of draining viscous red fluid away from his groin. And so he was in rough shape. And Laura was really beating herself up about it because she was caught sort of between a rock and a hard place, right? She was afraid to use Medicaid, even emergency Medicaid, which her family was eligible for, because she had previously been arrested and detained. It was actually, she was arrested because, she was pulled over for allegedly having a broken taillight. They realized she was undocumented, arrested her, put her in jail. And she was released. This was years ago. But she was so terrified that this would happen again, and that under this circumstance, this regime, she would be deported and separated from her family. So she and her family waited and waited and waited when her father was ill until the last moment when they thought, okay, we can't wait anymore. We have to take him to the emergency room. And she, contextualized this dilemma that she had, saying, you don't ask for help because they already said that they're going to report you or something. That's the fear, asking for help. Maybe there are places like this clinic where they don't, but not like at the hospital where they ask if you have insurance or not. That's that fear. When they ask that, I tremble. You don't look for help, but when it gets to be an emergency, sometimes I get to thinking maybe if my dad had seen a doctor sooner, maybe now he wouldn't be going to dialysis. And in fact, Laura actually had diabetes as well, and she was experiencing symptoms, but she had no way to pay for medication or get care or treat it. So she had diabetic neuropathy, and realized that, her situation might escalate just like her father's did, but she felt like there was nothing she could really do about it. Similarly, Karina felt like she was in a catch-22, but she was in the purple state, and I interviewed her in January of 2020. And she had lived in the United States since childhood. She had actually submitted an application for DACA before the Trump administration, but it got caught up and she didn't really understand what was going on with her application. And when she asked lawyers about what she should do, they all said, don't touch it, right? Under this administration, we don't know what's going to happen with DACA, and it's better to just leave things alone rather than draw attention to your case and then potentially draw attention and be deported. So she was concerned about being on the radar, but she had also had an emergency Medicaid at one point when she was pregnant and delivered her U.S.-born children. Her U.S.-born children were enrolled in Medicaid, right? So she was sort of walking along this tightrope between being under government surveillance, but also trying to avoid it. And one of the tricky things for her is that in her purple state, they set up these sort of like roadblocks, right? These traffic stops where they would pull over everybody, but typically in places where there were a lot of Latinx folks, and pull them over, check their IDs. And because she used to have a visa, she was at one time able to get a driver's license, but it expired and she wasn't able to renew it. So even she was pulled over 4 times at a checkpoint, and she got a letter from the DMV saying that if they catch her again, they're going to put her in jail. And so she said, you're always between a rock and a hard place, what with all you have to do for the kids, taking them to school or some appointment or something, but you always go with that fear, right? And so she was stuck in this catch-22, right? She's trying to do what's right, get her kids into healthcare, take them to their appointments, but if she gets pulled over, then she risks being deported and separated from her children, right? So that's some of the perspectives of the sort of nuanced and challenging healthcare negotiations that the patients experience. But I also talked with clinic workers, right? Like that's sort of the thing that launched my research was I was a case manager myself. I wanted to understand where do these cases go? And what I heard was from a lot of the clinic workers, there was intimidation and fear around government adjacent agencies. And this really undermined the work that they were doing to try to establish trust with communities. So Blue State worker Isabel said, what happens to our people, and Isabel is actually formerly undocumented immigrant from Latin America who also had experiences with Medicaid. She said, what happens to our people who come from really remote places and someone at a Medicaid office comes and tells them that they will send their documents to immigration? They see the worker as an authority, and she is the authority. She's from the government. Similarly, a community organization worker that worked with Isabel's clinic said then becomes a fear factor. If you hear from a trusted community member, like at Medicaid, that these are the possibilities of getting care, and at that time, knowing this is how your application is kept, then the fear factor sets in. Then they choose to opt out, or they go back to the community advocate or liaison to figure out, I don't want to do this. I don't know. Like, right? Their trust in some of these benevolent arms of government agencies like healthcare is undermined by their fear of immigration enforcement agencies. And Olivia, who's a worker I spoke with him in 2015 and 2018, kind of helped me understand this at different points in the sort of shifting political administrations. Back in 2015, she said, we know exactly what they're doing. And by they, she means the Medicaid agency. They're just checking your immigration status against the database they have access to. And I don't know if it's the immigration database, I don't know exactly what it is, but they're just checking that against it. And if it doesn't match, they will let you know it doesn't match. But when I spoke to her again in 2018, after the Trump administration came to power and after there was a lot of confusion around how the public charge rule might be changed, that certainty wasn't there anymore. Olivia said, today we know where the application goes. It goes to the same place. But these days we don't know because anyone could show up there and ask to see those state Medicaid forms and ask to see the information. Anything could happen. And this created confusion and anxiety even within the clinic among the workers themselves, right? They started asking, what if they want to see, if they ask to see medical records, and our own immigrant staff too? We spent a whole meeting talking about immigration things, and it created that anxiety in everyone. I was really angry that day, you know? And she's angry because the healthcare, the clinic exists to provide healthcare, right? They're not there to be immigration law experts. They're not there to be immigration enforcement workers. But having to spend all this precious time that is supposed to be dedicated to patient care to immigration law really frustrated a lot of folks that were working in these safety net clinics. And I saw similar dynamics, but in a sort of different policy context in the purple state with the case of Dr. Beckett. Again, these are pseudonyms, but Dr. Beckett was previously the Department of Public Health medical director in a county that I did research in. And she and a nurse I called Justine actually were investigated for providing healthcare to immigrants in their state. Now, it's important to emphasize that this did not happen under the Trump administration or even the Obama administration. This was years prior. But it made it very difficult for me to do research in these settings because people remembered the case of Dr. Beckett and were afraid to speak with me. They were afraid of any association with immigration scholarship, immigrants. They didn't want to be getting that kind of attention because they thought they would lose funding and maybe end up with some of these charges like Dr. Beckett and Justine experienced. So what happened in Dr. Beckett's case is they were trying to resolve this issue of how to reconcile postpartum leave letters with employers for patients who worked under an alias. So the patient might have one name in their medical chart, but they might work under a different name, right? Because they were maybe working with borrowed papers or, you know, working with a different number. And again, this all kind of varies depending on what time frame you're looking at. But essentially, they had two different names and they wanted to make sure that they charted this properly in their medical records, right? And so they asked for guidance. No one really had an answer. And they tried to say, okay, well, we'll just document both names and we'll try to figure it out. In that process, some people who weren't really aware of the issue of what they were doing started saying, well, this looks funny to me. And a person who was running for a political role on the Board of Health caught wind of this and thought, oh, this is a great opportunity for me to use this as political capital, because I think I'm going to get a lot of support with the anti-immigrant crowd, and I'm going to expose these medical providers for caring for potentially undocumented immigrants, right? And so they ended up, Dr. Beckett got a call saying, bring your badge, bring your keys, come to the office. And so she showed up, and not only was the County Board of Health political candidate there, but so was the county sheriff. And she said it was quite the show of force. And they investigated her, and they investigated Justine, and it was really disorienting because they had all these different charges levied against them. They had to hire different lawyers for the different charges. It was like aiding and abetting, Medicaid fraud. Sometimes they would learn about the charges in the local newspaper. I mean, it was a really traumatic experience. And ultimately, the investigation unfolded. There was no wrongdoing found at all on the clinic. But unfortunately, through the process, 5 undocumented immigrants were identified, and at least one was deported, at least from the records that I was able to find when I looked at the county records. And so, Dr. Beckett remembers this, and she said, this, political candidate had a lot of power. He said, I want those names. I want to look at those charts. I want to see what you wrote and see what you did. And from her perspective, this violated HIPAA, right? Which is a law that protects patient privacy. Basically the candidate made an argument saying that, well, this is a systems issue. It's a system issue with the whole healthcare department. So we have to, take all of the cases and review them, rather than saying this is an individual case and we're going to pull one individual's medical records, right? So he was able to sort of circumvent HIPAA. But from her perspective, she said, I'm not at all convinced that they legally got those records. Again, this created a chilling effect that endured over a decade, even when I was trying to do my research. And Dr. Garcia in the red state had a similar concern in her mind that Dr. Beckett had expressed. She said, my clients don't know about this. They don't know about the electronic record, right? Electronic medical records. I worry personally as a provider about the electronic record in terms of how much I should put in there. Should I even say they're undocumented? So I stopped saying that. I'm thinking that with the electronic record, it would be very easy to disclose a patient's legal status and for us to be required to do that, right? And sometimes this information is important. She's a behavioral health provider. Sometimes they need this information about, for example, someone's border crossing experience because they have PTSD. To get to the diagnosis, you need the social history. But she's, trying to be very, very judicious about what she includes in here because of this fear that immigration enforcement officials might get the records and that it could impact the patient. And she said, I get angry that I should even have to worry about shit like that, This has nothing to do with clients or treatment, but unfortunately it does. So this then segues into the final part of my talk, and I know I'm maybe a bit short on time, so I'll wrap it up with some of the examples of resisting medical legal violence within the clinic. And so in the purple state, I remember this oncology social worker named Nadine. She framed it as, we are a healthcare institution and our goal is to provide care. So she says, this is a medical institution. We're here to give you care. We're not here to get anybody else involved or to get you into trouble. And people are scared, and they're more scared now than they have ever been. And this was in 2020 when I talked with Nadine. And similarly, Mateo, who worked at a front desk in one of the blue state clinics that I observed, he said, we're not here to throw anybody to ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We want to let people know that this is a safety zone here. We have plans what we will do. And some of the plans he described, I will sort of summarize at the end of the talk and actually connect it with some UC health center policies that are proposed right now. But yeah, they were coming up with their own clinic institutional policies to try to protect patients. And he said, any patient that comes here, we have informed them that they can't detain no one in our clinic unless they have a warrant, I believe. So I try to educate our patients not to stress about these situations that they shouldn't be stressing about. And he said, I actually had a patient come here requesting what would happen if she ever got detained, and she wanted someone else to be the responsible party for her kid. Parents are worried that if they get detained, they'll get separated from their kids. Families don't want to get separated. And Dr. Garcia, who was talking about the electronic medical record, she said, for those who are fearful, they create these emergency separation packets and they make multiple copies. And she said, it's a way for them to get a little control over their life, right? So it's not perfect. It's kind of reactionary, but it's something that they can do. Some of the other strategies that I saw or I observed in action over the course of my research were clinics partnering with legal experts, having a really firm connection with legal aid organizations, or bringing in attorneys to explain immigration law to them, right? They also developed awareness to work with the law with laws that they saw as supportive, and also against certain laws that they saw as maybe questionable, or things were always under injunctions and under court review. Litigation was always happening with a lot of the things under the Trump administration. So there was a lot of confusion, and they were trying to figure out, okay, which laws can we work with and which laws are kind of working against us that we should be wary of. So they developed working knowledge of HIPAA. Again, that's that privacy law that exists in the United States. And they also developed awareness of the Fourth Amendment and the privacy protections, right? So they would develop ICE protocols, and that involved creating personnel bottlenecks. For example, that front desk staff, Mateo, would not be the person that's responsible for responding to immigration enforcement officials if they came into the clinic, right? That person would say, oh, this is above my pay grade. I'm not authorized to deal with immigration enforcement. You have to speak with our chief medical officer, or you have to speak with our legal representative. They have to review the warrant. They would also designate certain spaces as private versus public. Maybe the waiting room is public, but the exam rooms are private. And so they would call patients back one by one, not to make a scene, but say, oh, so-and-so, please come back. And that would bring the patients back into the private space to protect them from sort of the space where immigration enforcement might be able to be present without a warrant. They even learned the difference between a judicial warrant, which has a really high standard and has to be signed by a judge and very specific criteria have to be met, versus an administrative warrant, which they don't have to honor. So very, very nuanced legal sort of immigration law and constitutional law knowledge they had to start developing. And they also confronted and trained government agency workers to clarify these misunderstandings and intervene on intimidation. They hosted Know Your Rights trainings. They developed emergency preparation kits for families, and they emphasized an ethos of care through their clinical practices that sort of pushed against these narratives of suspicion and discipline and fraud that were coming very much from the federal and sometimes the state and local governments as well. So I said that I would bring up some, one of these sort of resistance practices. And I saw in my email, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks ago, this email. I think it's for the academic Senate faculty. So if you're faculty and you're on this call, maybe this applies to you. But there's this sort of policy called Responding to Immigration Enforcement Issues Involving Patients in UC Health Facilities. And you can actually see some of these same things that I saw documented in my research that are becoming institutional policies, or have been, or they're sort of being reinforced as healthcare institutions on an institution by institution level. So it's a comment period right now. You can make comments until May 16th. So I encourage you to check it out, and you'll see how some of this resistance happens in action. But yeah, this is sort of one of the more kind of defensive strategies to say, let's make this systematic across multiple institutions, even if we don't know what the priorities of a federal administration might be. So again, to sort of bring this home and close the talk, I just want to emphasize that all of these examples I've shared with you are examples of medical legal violence. And they are a combination of white supremacy, anti-immigrant laws, and exploitative labor conditions that disproportionately impact Latinx immigrant communities, and that also start to bring bring healthcare workers into the immigration law dragnet. And all of this is a mechanism to help uphold racial capitalism in the United States, right? So I hope that has given you a bit of the sort of abstract sort of framing of the theory and the literature, but also the concrete consequences, the material consequences of these immigration and healthcare policies in people's everyday life, and in the consequences for clinical care. So thank you so much for attending my talk. I really appreciate it. And thank you again to the UC Merced Library for hosting this.
Thank you so much. I thought that was so interesting. And I'm seeing it looks like some applause reaction emojis happening. So we do have some time for questions. So if folks want to raise your hand or just unmute yourself, or if you want to put anything into the chat, you can go ahead and do that too.
Thanks so much for your talk. I had a question that's related to the trust and fear, and you already mentioned some of the challenges around the research. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you did get that trust with folks so that you could conduct interviews, especially those who are trying to receive healthcare?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. The trust really was brokered through the clinics, right? So because even though there was a lot of fear and anxiety, the people who came to the clinic did express trust in the people that they were working with, in those frontline brokers. And because they saw me as sort of associated with the clinic staff, and that I was getting, usually the introductions were made through clinic staff, I think there was a transference of trust to me. And I don't know that I mentioned this in the outset of the talk, but of course, I never asked anybody about their legal status. Any of that information that came about came through the interview. It was sort of, it either became clear through the details they shared with me, or they were open about it. It was really challenging in the purple state to find anybody who would work with me. So even getting like clinics to participate, again, I think a lot in part because I heard many times this sort of legend of Dr. Beckett. And so in that case, I actually was only able to really connect and do observations at a free clinic where they didn't receive any government, like any federal aid. It was all sort of private donations based. And in that case, I said, I was like, I understand there's a lot of fear in this context and people don't really want to work with me. And he said, well, I don't get any money from the government. So whatever, they close me down tomorrow, I'll just start up again somewhere else, right? It was a very small free clinic because of that. But there was trust because it wasn't associated with the government, associated with like the state and the immigration enforcement apparatus. So I think I relied entirely on the brokering of trust through that. And then also just through my professional networks is how I was able to, have the clinics trust me in the first place, because they knew I was a case manager. They knew that I had done similar work to what they did previously. So I don't think they saw me as particularly suspicious. So yeah, I guess those are sort of the strategies that I relied on to engage trust and benefit from the trust that already existed in these situational contexts.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your talk, Meredith. Super interesting and just really fabulously done talk, I have to say. But I'm wondering, within the states, did you see differences? Like, did you look at urban versus rural? And I guess you just mentioned the private clinics maybe felt like they had more freedom. I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, I mean, the local context is there were a lot of differences. I think the power of the federal immigration enforcement regime really permeated all of them, especially in the Trump era. But certainly the best place that you could possibly be out of all of the three, if you were undocumented and had some kind of chronic illness or needed comprehensive care, was the blue state. There were mechanisms for you to get healthcare coverage if you had a qualifying health condition that were not available in the red or purple state. So, like there were possibilities. However, those same possibilities, when the Trump administration came to power, made people really scared because they thought, well, great, I got this state aid and now I'm on a list, right? Especially, I spoke with like oncology social workers in the blue state, and they said, people are calling us to get off their chemotherapy because Trump was elected. And now they think that I'm going to be deported, right? So it was a double-edged sword, right? The people that were living in the more, in these local contexts where they had really strong law enforcement and immigration enforcement connections, they were already used to being surveilled. They were already used to being suspicious of the clinic. They were already used to not being able to get care ever through like comprehensive Medicaid. So not a lot changed for them, except for just this heightened rhetoric of being like, oh, increasingly surveilled. But
yeah, I should have. I'm sorry.
State. Go ahead.
I totally got from your talk. There's a difference between the red states, blue states in terms of their availability of care. I was wondering about the fear of surveillance and of fear of immigration and getting caught within, like, say, within a blue state. Like, would there be a difference between a urban area and a rural area?
I think, yeah, it seemed to me in the interviews that I did in the blue state that there was less concern about like law enforcement, right? Like people, I had an example of someone that got pulled over, he like he didn't really care. He was like, oh, maybe I got a ticket and I paid my ticket. Versus immigration enforcement in the blue state was a fear, right? Like they were afraid of raids. They were less concerned, at least in what they expressed to me, about like the local police versus in the and so like in that case, rural, urban, whatever it was, the prevalence of immigration enforcement as a federal power, that in the blue state was sort of what took precedence, as opposed to, now it would have been different in other, like if it hadn't been such a progressive jurisdiction, if it had been another part of the blue state, if they had had maybe a county with a more sort of like conservative anti-immigrant sheriff, it could be very different. That just wasn't the case in the county I observed. But in other places, they had really strong 287G agreements. So in the counties that I looked at, one was urban and one was more rural. So the red state was urban, but it was urban in its core, but it had a lot of rural areas. It's just a massive county. And so that I think that the presence of law enforcement as immigration enforcement was pervasive across urban, rural, whatever. It was just everywhere you're at risk. And then in the purple state, the county, even though it was rural, and so you maybe just wouldn't have as many opportunities for law enforcement contact because it's just more remote, they had the checkpoints, right? So, and they had really, really like the law enforcement agents in that particular county were really excited about being 287G partners and exercising immigration enforcement authority through the local. So it was really weird because in that purple state, a county away was a progressive county with progressive leaders, and everybody on their lawn had like everyone is welcome here, and had all these political signs that gestured toward like inclusion. And then you go one county away and they're like 287G agreement. We want to, like, and then another adjacent county had a detention center that they had used federal dollars to turn into, like, it was a county jail, but they expanded it by making an immigration detention center as well, right? So the local politics, county by county, with things like how are we going to develop our penal system and use federal dollars? Like they did the opposite. Instead of taking Medicaid, and expanding healthcare services with federal dollars, they took the federal dollars that were available through incarceration, right? And like the sort of prison industrial complex, and use those as a sort of a public investment strategy and priority. So it was really, it varied county by county. Less so like urban versus rural, and more so I think just like county politics. It's so, the interlocking puzzle pieces are so complex, right? And they can shift from administration to administration in really surprising ways.
Thank you. That's super interesting.
Thank you. I'm also seeing a question in the chat that says, how did the experience affect you?
That's a good question. Well, first, it was really disorienting to think that I just planned to do a project in one institution. Like I was going to do a deep ethnography in one clinic and just spend a lot of time there in a blue state. And then because of the 2016 election, really, like because of the escalating anti-immigrant politics, a lot of people were asking me like, oh, your research seems really relevant right now. Are you going to expand it? Are you going to go to places that are like more sort of Trump country or whatever? And a lot of my colleagues felt that they couldn't do that work because of their social position. And I was well situated because I'm a US citizen. I have white privilege. I can go into institutions and especially healthcare institutions, and people perceive me as like benevolent. I don't know. They think I'm a social worker or something. So I had a lot of entree that was denied to a lot of people who are already doing this research. Right. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm expanding and I'm going into some of these places that I wouldn't naturally have sought out. But because the political situation is like this, and because of how I'm socially positioned and institutionally positioned, I'm actually I have a position of relative power to explore some of these questions without consequence to me. So it pushed me to do a research project that I didn't actually envision at the outset. And it was rough, like, because, this is anytime you're doing medical sociology and you're embedded in clinical institutions, the consequences of the policies are life and death. right? So not everybody lives. Like you might be interviewing somebody at the beginning of a project and then they're not there anymore by the end because they've, and in my book case, it was less so. However, there were people who were talking about like, if I go back to my home country, like if I run out of care here, I guess I'll go back to my country of origin to die so I can see my family one last time. And that's something I've heard frequently. So those stories were, they're hard to hear. And also people were like crying, right? People were really emotional. They were shaking, and not just the patients, but the clinic workers. That unsettled me the most. And so I had to really learn how to, unfortunately I had been a case manager and a healthcare interpreter before. So we learned to control our expressions and just sort of roll with whatever really hideous information might be presented to us in terms of trauma or abuses or whatever. So for me, I learned how to I learned how to be, I think sympathetic and empathetic within the bounds of what a scholar can and should do, right? Having tissue ready, but also, and just giving people time, turning off the recorder. Then in my own time, having colleagues that I could decompress with or vent with, especially with all the anti-immigrant sentiment, we were angry, we were sad, and at the same time, my own parents were really, really sick. They were in the ICU. So I was going I was doing clinic ethnography and then I'd go to the ICU and then I would just be I felt like I was never not in a clinic and, there'd be someone on dialysis and I was like, oh no, I know this too well and I don't want to see this anymore. Right. And I was also interpreting I was volunteer interpreting. I was working as an interpreter on the side. So I was still my side hustle as a graduate student for a lot of this was to work as a contract interpreter. So I was in clinic institutions being the interpreter. So I was in the story and outside the story. And I was interpreting occasionally in a detention setting. So, and this was when asylum law was changing. So it felt a lot of times really futile. It felt really discouraging. And I don't know. So I will just say, personally, I'm really glad that I had great therapists along the way. I had great colleagues, right, that I could vent with and we could kind of commiserate. And I also had a place that I could vent all of my sort of personal experiences and dump them so that I didn't carry them into the interviews and ask the participants to help process things for me, right? I was able to sort of stay empathetic and sympathetic and kind of more not neutral, but human without being, but sometimes I would bite the inside of my cheek because I could feel myself and I have to undo all of that training now, but I would just sort of be I have to keep my cool. I have to be non-threatening and chill presence. But yeah, so I just always a call out for mental health support, shout out for all of the therapists and psychologists out there who help us do the work that we do. Because sometimes it got hard. Yeah.
Thank you. We still have a couple more minutes. I don't know if there's one more quick question anybody has. And if not, I have a quick question. I'm wondering if there are other models in other countries that you think do this a lot better to provide healthcare to folks. And so I was wondering if there is maybe if there are a couple of models that you would point to as being better.
That's a great question. At another time, several years ago, I might have said look at places that have universal healthcare coverage, just at the national level, national healthcare systems. However, you have to examine white supremacy within those, right? Within those. So there's idea that healthcare is a universal human right. But when you have, for example, in France, a lot of migrants coming from Africa and the Middle East, then the idea that health is a universal human right starts to erode because it's well, it was a right for everybody who we thought was French, right? And so there are scholars Tickton, I think, comes to mind first, but that write about this, this shift in the idea of sort of advanced social democracy that has this really expansive welfare state when someone who's perceived as not the right kind of citizen is seeking care. And so like what are the limits of humanitarianism in that and the humanitarian ethos? So, so it's like a qualified, there are places that have universal healthcare, and that's what we should have. Like we should be following that model, right? And not healthcare as a commodity. However, if you don't disentangle it from white supremacy, then it reifies those stratification systems. I think like at a state level, California is probably at the vanguard because we're expanding Medi-Cal. We're going through various expansions of Medi-Cal to previously like excluded folks, right? So by 2024, everybody who's income eligible, irrespective of their legal status, will be eligible for Medicaid in California Medi-Cal. I think that is a great example, because if it's at the state level, and if it could be maybe reproduced in other states, it will be less like anti-immigrant administration will target specifically California to target the immigrants living there because they get state level services, right? If you can scale that up, I think it really has the potential to improve people's care, because it starts to frame it more as a right than as a privilege of citizenship and a privilege of those who can pay. So I don't know. That really answers the question, but it's an excellent question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everybody for coming today. I think this is a great presentation, and there's so much to think about now. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for hosting me, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.